The morning sun streamed through the large glass windows of the airport terminal, casting long shadows across the polished floor. 8-year-old Sophie Jenkins clutched her small pink backpack to her chest, her eyes wide with excitement as she looked up at the massive departures board hanging overhead. This was only her 3rd time flying, and the hustle and bustle of the airport still filled her with wonder. "Dad, how much longer until we board?" Sophie asked, tugging at the sleeve of her father's worn navy sweater. Richard Jenkins glanced down at his daughter with a warm smile. Unlike the crisp business suits he typically wore to the office, today he was dressed in faded jeans, a comfortable sweater, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Few would recognize him as the CEO and majority owner of Skyway Airlines, one of the country's largest carriers, and that was exactly how he wanted it. "Just about 15 minutes, sweetheart," Richard replied, checking his watch. "Are you excited?" Sophie nodded eagerly, her dark pigtails bouncing. "Can I have the window seat?" "Of course," and Richard chuckled. "I wouldn't dream of taking it from you." What Sophie didn't know was that this wasn't just a regular father-daughter trip to visit her grandmother in California. Richard had been receiving concerning reports about declining customer service standards on some Skyway routes, particularly the one they were about to board. Rather than rely solely on customer surveys and formal evaluations, Richard occasionally traveled incognito to experience his airline as an ordinary passenger would. He never announced these trips to staff. It was the only way to get an honest assessment. "Flight 372 to Los Angeles is now boarding at Gate 14, announced a pleasant voice over the intercom. Sophie jumped up and down. "That's us, Dad." "That's us!" Richard took his daughter's hand. "Remember what we talked about? You stay right with me, okay?" As they joined the line of passengers preparing to board, Richard observed everything with a practiced eye. The efficiency of the gate staff, the cleanliness of the boarding area, the demeanor of the ground crew. So far, everything looked up to standard. He nodded slightly to himself, pleased. The line moved steadily forward, and soon it was their turn. A gate agent with a tired smile checked their boarding passes and waved them through. Richard noticed the agent didn't make eye contact with either of them, a small detail he mentally filed away for later. The jetway stretched before them, and Sophie skipped ahead, pulling her dad along. "Come on, I want to see our plane." At the aircraft door, they were greeted by a flight attendant with short blonde hair and a crisp uniform. Her name tag read Meredith Taylor. She offered a perfunctory smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her tone professional but distant. "Morning," Sophie replied cheerfully, bouncing on her toes. Richard and Sophie made their way down the narrow aisle of the aircraft. First class was already nearly full, but Richard had deliberately booked economy seats for this trip. He guided Sophie toward row 23, where they had a window and middle seat. "Dad, can I have my apple juice now?" Sophie asked as they settled in. Richard had bought her a small bottle at one of the airport shops, saving it for when they got on board. "Sure, honey. Just be careful, okay?" Sophie nodded seriously as she accepted the bottle. Richard helped her unscrew the cap, then turned to stow their carry-on bags in the overhead compartment. The flight was filling up quickly, the aisle crowding with passengers trying to find their seats and put away their luggage. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Sophie, trying to place her juice on the small tray table, misjudged the distance. The bottle tipped, then fell. Apple juice splashed across the carpet of the aisle, creating a small puddle. Sophie's eyes widened in horror. "Oops," she whispered, her voice small. Richard turned at the sound, immediately reaching for the pack of tissues in his pocket. "It's okay, sweetie. Accidents happen. Let's clean this up." Before he could bend down, a shadow fell across them. Flight attendant Meredith Taylor stood there, her face pinched with annoyance as she surveyed the spilled juice. "Are you kidding me?" she said, her voice sharp enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "We haven't even taken off yet." Sophie shrank back into her seat, her lower lip beginning to tremble. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Instead of acknowledging Sophie's apology, Meredith continued, her voice rising. "Do you know how many people I have to serve on this flight? Now I have to find someone to clean this up before we can take off. This is going to delay everyone." Heads turned throughout the cabin. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, others impatient. Sophie's cheeks flushed red with embarrassment as tears welled in her eyes. Richard straightened up slowly, his expression carefully neutral despite the anger he felt building inside. In his 20 years of building Skyway Airlines from a regional carrier to a national brand, he had emphasized one core principle above all others: treat every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of age or status. What he was witnessing now flew in the face of everything he'd worked to establish. "It was an accident," Richard said quietly. "I have tissues here and we can help clean it." Meredith barely glanced at him. "Sir, please just keep your daughter under control. We have procedures for this." Her tone made it clear she saw them as an inconvenience, nothing more. A tear slipped down Sophie's cheek. She was a sensitive child who took criticism to heart, and being scolded so publicly was overwhelming her. Richard put his arm around her shoulders protectively. "It's just juice," he said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. "And she's just a child." Meredith gave him a tight smile that held no warmth. "And this is just an airplane, sir, not a playground. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get a cleaning kit." She walked away briskly, leaving Richard and Sophie sitting in uncomfortable silence. Several nearby passengers averted their eyes while others shot sympathetic glances their way. "Am I in trouble, Dad?" Sophie whispered, a tear tracking down her cheek. Richard pulled her close. "No, sweetheart. Not at all. Sometimes people just have bad days and they forget to be kind." But even as he comforted his daughter, Richard was making mental notes. This incident would definitely be appearing in his report. Not just the spill. Accidents happened and airlines needed to be prepared to handle them. But the way Meredith had chosen to address the situation, publicly humiliating a child for a minor mishap. A young man in a maintenance uniform appeared a few minutes later with a small cleaning kit. Unlike Meredith, he offered Sophie a friendly wink as he quickly mopped up the spill. "No worries, little miss," he said cheerfully. "Happens all the time." "Good as new in no time." Sophie gave him a watery smile. Still sniffling slightly. "Thank you," Richard said, genuinely appreciative of the man's kindness. The maintenance worker nodded and moved on, while Meredith returned to continue her pre-flight duties. She pointedly avoided looking at Richard and Sophie as she helped other passengers stow their luggage and find their seats. As the final passengers boarded and the doors were closed, Richard discreetly observed the flight attendants' pre-flight preparations. Most of the crew seemed efficient and professional, but Meredith continued to project an air of impatience, rushing through safety demonstrations with minimal eye contact. "Look, Dad," Sophie whispered, her earlier distress beginning to fade as she pointed out the window. "The luggage cars are driving away." Richard smiled, grateful for his daughter's resilience. "That means we'll be taking off soon." The plane began to push back from the gate and the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing an on-time departure. Under normal circumstances, Richard would have felt a surge of pride at this. Punctuality was something he'd pushed hard for at Skyway. Today, however, his thoughts were elsewhere. As the flight attendants came through the cabin for a final check before takeoff, Meredith paused briefly beside their row. Her eyes fell on Sophie, who instinctively pressed closer to her father. "Seatbelt fastened properly?" Meredith asked, her tone clipped. Richard nodded, not trusting himself to speak politely. Meredith moved on without another word. The engines roared to life and Sophie's earlier excitement returned as the plane began to accelerate down the runway. She pressed her face to the window, watching as the ground fell away beneath them and the city shrank to miniature size. "We're flying, Dad," she exclaimed, momentarily forgetting the unpleasant encounter. Richard smiled, but his mind was already turning over the events of the past half hour. What he'd witnessed was exactly the kind of service breakdown he'd been hearing about in recent reports. Staff who seemed burned out, irritable, and lacking in basic empathy. The fact that he'd experienced it firsthand, and with his daughter as the target, made it all the more concerning. As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Richard knew one thing for certain. By the end of this flight, he would have a complete picture of the current state of Skyway's customer service, and when they landed in Los Angeles, changes would need to be made. What Meredith Taylor didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine as she continued to avoid their row during the initial drink service, was that the quiet, unremarkable man in the baseball cap could determine her future at Skyway with a single phone call. But Richard Jenkins wasn't that kind of leader. He believed in teaching moments and opportunities for growth. He watched as Sophie took out her coloring book, her resilient spirit already bouncing back from the embarrassment. The flight to Los Angeles would take nearly 6 hours. Richard settled back in his seat, prepared to observe every interaction, every service moment. And when they landed, he would decide exactly how to address what he'd seen. Not just for his daughter's sake, but for every passenger who flew with Skyway Airlines. The seatbelt sign had been off for 20 minutes, and the drink service cart was making its slow journey down the aisle. Sophie had recovered somewhat from the earlier embarrassment, her attention now fixed on the clouds drifting past her window. They looked like giant puffs of cotton candy, she thought, stretching out her small hand as if she could touch them through the glass. "Dad, do you think birds ever bump into planes?" she asked, her imagination running wild as it often did. Richard smiled, momentarily distracted from his mental notes about the airline service. "That's a good question. It does happen sometimes, but pilots are very careful to avoid it." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "I bet the birds are careful too. Nobody wants to crash." The drink cart finally reached their row, pushed by a different flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile. Meredith Taylor followed close behind, handling the snacks. "What can I get for you folks today?" the friendly attendant asked. Before Richard could answer, Sophie piped up. "May I have apple juice, please?" Then, remembering the earlier spill, she quickly added, "I'll be super careful this time." The friendly attendant smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. 1 apple juice coming up." Richard asked for water, watching as the attendant carefully placed Sophie's juice on her tray table, making sure it was stable. It was a small gesture of thoughtfulness that didn't go unnoticed. As the friendly attendant moved to the next row, Meredith stepped forward with the snack basket. She barely glanced at Sophie as she thrust the basket toward Richard. "Pretzels or cookies?" she asked flatly. "Which would you like, Sophie?" Richard asked his daughter. Sophie hesitated, clearly still intimidated by Meredith. "Cookies, please," she whispered. Meredith dropped a cookie packet on Sophie's tray without a word and moved on to the next passengers. Richard noticed how Sophie's shoulders relaxed once the flight attendant had passed. It bothered him deeply to see his normally outgoing daughter so affected. "How's your juice, sweetheart?" he asked, trying to lighten her mood. Sophie took a small sip. "It's good." She lowered her voice to a whisper. "But I think that lady doesn't like me very much." Richard gently squeezed her shoulder. "Don't worry about her. Sometimes people are having a bad day. A really, really bad day." Sophie agreed seriously, making Richard smile despite his concerns. An hour into the flight, Sophie needed to use the bathroom. Richard helped her out of her seat and walked her to the rear lavatory. On their way back, they passed the galley where Meredith was preparing coffee. "Excuse me," Richard said politely. "My daughter was wondering if she could have another cookie." It was a simple request, one that should have been met with a simple yes or no. Meredith looked up from the coffee pot with a sigh that suggested they'd asked her to reroute the plane. "We're supposed to limit snacks to 1 per passenger until we've completed the main service," she said stiffly. Before Richard could respond, an older flight attendant with silver-streaked hair appeared behind Meredith. "Oh, it's no trouble," she said, reaching for the snack drawer. "We have plenty." She handed Sophie a cookie with a wink. "Here you go, young lady, enjoy." "Thank you," Sophie said with a shy smile. As they turned to head back to their seats, Richard overheard Meredith's muttered comment. "This isn't a restaurant. Parents these days let their kids think they can have whatever they want." He pretended not to hear, guiding Sophie back to their row. The comment stung more than he cared to admit, not because it was directed at him, but because it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what customer service should be, especially on his airline. An elderly woman seated across the aisle leaned over as they settled back in. She had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "What a lovely daughter you have," she said to Richard. So polite. Richard thanked her and Sophie beamed at the compliment. "I'm Mrs. Chen," the woman continued. "I'm going to visit my new granddaughter in Los Angeles. She's just 3 months old." "That's wonderful," Richard replied. "This is Sophie and I'm Richard." "Nice to meet you," Sophie said, her natural friendliness returning now that she was away from Meredith's cold gaze. Mrs. Chen reached into her purse and pulled out a small tin. "Would you like a butterscotch candy, Sophie? My grandchildren always love these." Sophie looked to her father for permission. When he nodded, she accepted the candy with a thank you. "I heard what happened earlier," Mrs. Chen said quietly to Richard while Sophie unwrapped her treat. That flight attendant was unnecessarily harsh. Children spill things, it's part of life. Richard nodded, appreciating the woman's understanding. It is indeed. I've been flying for over 50 years, Mrs. Chen continued. There was a time when flight attendants were called stewardesses, and they treated passengers like welcomed guests. Some airlines still maintain that spirit of hospitality, but others? She trailed off with a small shrug. Richard couldn't help but feel a pang at her words. He had worked hard to make Skyway Airlines known for its exceptional customer service. If Mrs. Chen's experience was anything to go by, they were falling short of that goal. The flight progressed and lunch service began. Richard observed the crew's interactions with other passengers. Most of the attendants were professional and courteous, if not particularly warm. Meredith, however, continued to display the same impatient attitude she'd shown earlier. When she reached their row with the meal cart, her expression tightened visibly. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked Richard, barely making eye contact. "Pasta for me," Richard said. "And for my daughter?" Meredith looked at Sophie for the first time. "Same choices. Chicken or pasta?" Sophie, who had been quietly drawing in her notebook, looked up. "Chicken, please." As Meredith handed over their trays, Sophie's elbow bumped her armrest, causing her crayon to roll off her tray. Without thinking, she unbuckled her seatbelt to retrieve it. "Seatbelt on," Meredith snapped, loud enough for several rows to hear. "The sign is still illuminated." Sophie scrambled to refasten her belt, her hands trembling slightly. She was just getting her crayon. Richard explained evenly. "Rules are for everyone's safety," Meredith replied coldly. "Even children need to follow them." It wasn't what she said, but how she said it, with a patronizing tone that suggested both Sophie and Richard were too dim to understand basic safety rules. Richard noticed several nearby passengers exchanging uncomfortable glances. Mrs. Chen across the aisle shook her head in disapproval. "Everything okay here?" A male flight attendant had appeared, perhaps sensing the tension. "Fine," Meredith said shortly. "Just reminding our passengers about seatbelt safety." The male attendant smiled at Sophie. "That's a nice drawing you're working on." "Is that our airplane?" Sophie nodded, relaxing a little at his friendly tone. "She's quite the artist," Richard said, grateful for the man's intervention. "Well, I hope you'll keep drawing. Maybe you'll design airplanes someday," the attendant said before moving on. The contrast between the two flight attendants' approaches couldn't have been more stark. One treated passengers as inconveniences, the other as valued guests. As CEO of Skyway, Richard found himself wondering how many Merediths worked for his airline compared to how many of the friendly attendants. The thought troubled him deeply. After lunch, Sophie continued drawing in her notebook. Richard noticed she had started a new page titled "My Airplane Ride." She drew herself looking sad with tears, and a stick figure with blonde hair frowning nearby. "What's that, Sophie?" he asked gently. "It's about today," she explained. "See, this is me when I spilled my juice, and this is the angry lady." On the next page, she had drawn herself smiling with Mrs. Chen and the kind male flight attendant. "These are the nice people," she said. Richard felt a mixture of pride in his daughters, resilience and disappointment that her flight experience had been marred by Meredith's behavior. This trip was supposed to be special, Sophie's first visit to her grandmother since her birthday. Instead, it had become an object lesson in poor customer service. Mid-flight, Meredith walked past their row just as Sophie was taking a sip of her second apple juice. The flight had hit a small patch of turbulence, and Sophie struggled to keep the cup steady. Seeing this, Richard quickly reached over to help, but not before a few drops spilled onto the tray table. Meredith paused, eyeing the small spill. Sophie froze, clearly expecting another scolding. "I'll get you a napkin," Meredith said with a sigh that suggested this was an enormous inconvenience. "No need," Richard replied, already pulling a tissue from his pocket. "We've got it covered." Meredith rolled her eyes slightly, a subtle gesture, but one that Richard didn't miss. "Suit yourself," she murmured before continuing down the aisle. Once she was out of earshot, Mrs. Chen leaned over again. "You have the patience of a saint," she whispered to Richard. "If I were that child's parent, I might have said something by now." Richard smiled diplomatically. Everyone deserves the benefit of the doubt, but privately he was cataloging every interaction, every raised eyebrow, every impatient sigh. As CEO, he rarely got to see the unfiltered passenger experience, This flight was proving more educational than he had anticipated, though not in the way he had hoped. 3 hours into the flight, Sophie had fallen asleep, her head resting against her father's arm. Richard used this opportunity to jot down some notes on his phone, observations about the service, ideas for improvements, and specific concerns that needed addressing. He noticed Meredith standing in the galley, speaking to another flight attendant in hushed but animated tones. Though he couldn't hear their words, her body language suggested frustration. The other attendant nodded sympathetically, occasionally glancing down the aisle. Richard wondered what pressures Meredith might be facing. Were working conditions at Skyway contributing to her attitude? Were there systemic issues that needed addressing beyond individual behavior? These were questions he would need to explore when he returned to headquarters. As the plane began its initial descent into Los Angeles, Sophie woke up, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Are we there yet?" she asked, a question Richard had heard countless times on their travels. "Almost, sweetheart. About 30 minutes to go." Sophie looked out the window at the sprawling city below, her earlier troubles temporarily forgotten in the excitement of arrival. Richard watched his daughter's face light up with wonder, and he made a silent promise. The experience they'd had today, the good and the bad, would not be in vain. Changes would be made. Standards would be reinforced. What Meredith Taylor didn't know as she prepared the cabin for landing was that this routine flight would have far-reaching consequences, not just for her, but for Skyway Airlines as a whole. The quiet man in row 23 and his little girl had set wheels in motion that would transform the company's approach to customer service. And as the plane touched down on the runway at LAX, Richard Jenkins had already decided exactly what needed to happen next. The plane taxied slowly toward the gate at Los Angeles International Airport. Sophie pressed her nose against the window, watching the ground crew in their bright yellow vests direct the massive aircraft to its final parking position. The California sunshine bathed everything in a golden glow, a stark contrast to the gray skies they'd left behind on the East Coast. "Look at all those planes, Dad," Sophie exclaimed, pointing at the adjacent gates where aircraft of various airlines stood waiting. Richard smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. Despite the unpleasant interactions with Meredith throughout the flight, Sophie's natural resilience had prevailed. Children, he thought, had an amazing capacity to bounce back from negative experiences, a quality many adults would do well to maintain. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles, where the local time is 1:37 p.m. and the temperature is a beautiful 75 degrees. On behalf of Skyway Airlines and our entire crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We hope to see you again soon." As passengers began gathering their belongings, Richard remained seated, in no rush to join the inevitable crush in the aisle. He watched Meredith and the other flight attendants prepare for deplaning, their practiced movements efficient after years of routine. "Dad, can I get my backpack now?" Sophie asked, unbuckling her seatbelt. "Let's wait a few minutes until some of these people clear out," Richard suggested. "Less crowded that way." Mrs. Chen from across the aisle stood up slowly, her arthritic hands gripping the seat in front of her for support. "Was this your first flight?" she asked Sophie with a kind smile. Sophie shook her head. "My third. I flew to Disney World last year and once to visit my aunt in Chicago." "Well, you're quite the experienced traveler then," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "Much more than I was at your age. Back then, flying was a rare luxury." As Mrs. Chen carefully retrieved her bag from the overhead bin, Richard noticed she was struggling with its weight. Without hesitation, he stood up. "Allow me," he offered, reaching up to help her. "Oh, thank you, young man," Mrs. Chen said gratefully. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." Richard easily lifted her suitcase down and set it beside her. "Do you have someone meeting you at the airport?" "My son will be waiting," she replied. "He's probably already at baggage claim, wondering what's taking his old mother so long." She chuckled softly. The aisle had begun to clear, and Richard judged it was a good time for them to gather their things. He helped Sophie with her backpack, then retrieved his own carry-on from the overhead compartment. "Ready to see Grandma?" he asked his daughter. Sophie nodded eagerly. "Do you think she made cookies like she promised?" "Knowing your grandmother, she probably baked enough to feed the entire neighborhood." Richard laughed. They made their way toward the front of the plane, joining the thinning line of departing passengers. Mrs. Chen walked just ahead of them, moving carefully down the aisle. Near the exit, the flight crew stood in a row, offering practice smiles and thank yous to departing passengers. The captain, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades in the cockpit, stood just inside the cockpit door, occasionally nodding to passengers as they filed past. When Mrs. Chen reached Meredith, the flight attendant barely looked up from her tablet, offering a perfunctory thank you for flying with us that sounded more like a recording than a genuine expression of gratitude. As Richard and Sophie approached the exit, Richard made a split-second decision. Throughout the flight, he had observed, taken mental notes, and remained anonymous. Now it was time for a different approach. "Excuse me," he said to Meredith, his voice pleasant but firm. "Could I speak with the captain before we deplane?" Meredith looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. Passengers rarely asked to speak with the captain these days, especially at the end of a flight when everyone was eager to disembark. "Is there a problem with the flight?" she asked, her tone suggesting she hoped there wasn't. Not because she cared about his experience, but because a complaint would mean paperwork. "No problem with the flight itself," Richard replied evenly. "Just a matter I'd like to discuss." Meredith sighed, making no effort to hide her impatience. "The captain is preparing for the next leg of his journey. If you have feedback, I'd be happy to pass it along." Her tone made it clear that happy was far from what she'd be. Sophie stood quietly beside her father, watching the exchange with curious eyes. "I understand he's busy," Richard said, his tone remaining cordial, "but I believe he'll want to speak with me." Something in his voice, a quiet authority that hadn't been present in their previous interactions, made Meredith look at him more closely. She seemed to be weighing whether this passenger was worth bothering the captain over. "Your name?" she asked, her fingers hovering over her tablet. "Richard Jenkins," he replied simply. The effect was immediate but subtle. Meredith's eyes widened just a fraction, and her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. If Richard hadn't been watching for it, he might have missed the change. But it was there. The dawning recognition, the mental connection being made between the name and its significance. "Mr. Jenkins," she repeated, her voice now carefully controlled. "One moment, please." She stepped to the cockpit door and knocked lightly. The captain opened it, raising an eyebrow in question. "Captain Winters," Meredith said, her voice noticeably more professional than it had been moments before. "Mr. Richard Jenkins would like to speak with you." Captain Winters stepped out of the cockpit immediately, his face breaking into a genuine smile of recognition. "Mr. Jenkins!" What a pleasant surprise. He extended his hand, which Richard shook firmly. "Captain Winters, good to see you again," Richard said warmly. "I hope you don't mind the interruption." "Not at all, sir," the captain replied with genuine respect in his voice. "It's an honor to have you aboard. Had I known you were on the passenger list, that's precisely why I didn't make my presence known," Richard explained. "I wanted to experience the flight as any other passenger would." From the corner of his eye, Richard could see Meredith's face losing color as the implications of this exchange became clear. The ordinary passenger in casual clothes whom she had treated with such dismissive impatience was, in fact, her boss, not just any boss, but the CEO and owner of the entire airline. Sophie, oblivious to the undercurrents of the adult conversation, tugged at her father's sleeve. "Dad, do you know him?" Captain Winters looked down at the little girl with a kind smile. "Your dad and I have known each other for a long time, young lady. He's a very important person to everyone who works at Skyway Airlines." Meredith had taken a small step back, her tablet clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. The other flight attendants were watching the exchange with interest, whispering among themselves, "Thank you for flying with us today." "Mr. Jenkins," Captain Winters continued, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the unusual situation. "I hope everything met your expectations." Richard's expression remained pleasant but neutral. The flight itself was smooth, as always. "Captain Winters, I'd like you to meet my daughter Sophie. This is her third flight with Skyway." Captain Winters bent down slightly to Sophie's level. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Sophie. Did you enjoy flying on one of your dad's planes today?" Sophie's brow furrowed in confusion. "Dad's planes?" The captain glanced up at Richard, realizing his mistake. "Ah, I see." Richard smiled gently at his daughter. "Sophie, there's something I haven't told you about my job. I don't just work at an office. I actually run Skyway Airlines, The company that owns this plane and all the others like it. Sophie's eyes grew round as saucers. You own the whole airplane? She gasped, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Several people who had been lingering to collect their belongings turned to look. Meredith's face had now drained completely of color, and she seemed frozen in place, unable to look away from the unfolding scene. Not just this one, Captain Winters said with a chuckle. Your dad owns all of our airplanes. Sophie looked up at her father with newfound awe. But then, why did the lady yell at me for spilling my juice, if it's your airplane? The innocent question hung in the air. Several passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident exchanged knowing glances. One man near the back actually chuckled softly. Meredith looked as though she might sink through the floor. Her colleague, the kind male flight attendant who had admired Sophie's drawing, seemed to be suppressing a smile. Richard placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. Well, sweetheart, that's because Ms. Taylor didn't know who I was. And that's okay. When we travel together, I don't usually tell people what my job is. He turned to Meredith, his expression neutral, but his eyes conveying a clear message. We all have our off days, don't we, Ms. Taylor? Meredith managed a stiff nod, her professional composure barely intact. Yes, sir, Mr. Jenkins. Captain Winters, sensing the tension, smoothly intervened. Mr. Jenkins, it's been a pleasure having you and your daughter aboard today. Please give my regards to your mother. I believe she was one of our very first flight attendants back in the day, wasn't she? Indeed she was, Richard confirmed. In fact, that's who we're here to visit. Please tell her Captain Winters sends his highest regards, the captain said. She trained many of our senior crew, and her standards of service remain legendary at Skyway. This additional revelation seemed to hit Meredith like a physical blow. Not only had she been rude to the CEO's daughter, but she had done so to the granddaughter of a revered former employee, one known specifically for setting the gold standard in customer service. I'll be sure to tell her, Richard promised. She always enjoys hearing from the old crew. He turned to go, then paused as if remembering something. Oh, and Ms. Taylor? I'd like to see you in my office on Monday morning at 9 a.m. My assistant will send you the details. Meredith swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Richard took Sophie's hand. Come on, sweetheart. Grandma's waiting, and I bet those cookies are getting cold. As they walked up the jetway, Sophie looked back over her shoulder at the still stunned flight attendant. Dad, she whispered, though not quietly enough that those nearby couldn't hear. Is that lady going to get fired? Richard squeezed his daughter's hand. That's not a decision I'm going to make today. Everyone deserves a chance to explain their side of things. They emerged into the bright terminal, leaving behind a cockpit crew trying not to smile and a flight attendant who looked as though her world had just collapsed around her. News of what had happened spread quickly among the ground staff. As Richard and Sophie made their way toward baggage claim, they passed airport employees who nodded respectfully or straightened their posture when they realized who was walking by. Your bag will be first off the plane, sir, one baggage handler assured him, hurrying ahead to alert his colleagues. That's really not necessary, Richard called after him, but the man was already gone. Sophie looked up at her father with a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. Dad, are you famous or something? Richard chuckled softly. Not famous, sweetheart. Just someone who tries to make sure people can travel safely and comfortably. He paused, then added thoughtfully, and someone who believes that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness, especially little girls who accidentally spill their juice. Sophie giggled, the sound bright and clear in the busy terminal. As they walked hand in hand toward the exit, Richard couldn't help but wonder what Monday's meeting with Meredith Taylor would bring. One thing was certain. It would be a conversation that both of them would remember for a very long time. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn. The Skyway Airline's headquarters stood tall against the skyline, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Inside, on the top floor, Richard Jenkins sat at his desk, reviewing the notes he'd compiled after Friday's flight. The weekend with his mother had been wonderful. Sophie had been thoroughly spoiled with homemade cookies and stories from her grandmother's days as one of the first flight attendants for what was then a tiny regional airline. Richard's mother had been particularly interested in hearing about their experience on the flight, though Richard had been careful not to share too many details. He wanted to approach the situation with Meredith Taylor professionally, not colored by family emotions. His assistant, Diane, knocked lightly on his open door. "Mr. Jenkins, Ms. Taylor is here for your 9 o'clock. Richard glanced at his watch. 8:55 a.m. Meredith was early, which didn't surprise him. "Thank you, Diane. Please give me 2 minutes, then show her in." As Diane left, Richard opened his desk drawer and pulled out a child's drawing, one of Sophie's creations from the flight. She had given him permission to keep it when he'd explained he wanted to show it to the lady from the plane. The simple artwork showed a stick figure with tears falling down its face and an adult figure with an angry expression, arms raised. He placed the drawing on his desk next to a folder containing Meredith Taylor's employment history. 15 years of service with Skyway Airlines. Generally positive performance reviews, though there had been a downward trend over the past 3 years. A few customer complaints, but nothing that had triggered disciplinary action. Until now. At precisely 9 a.m., Diane escorted Meredith into the office. Richard noticed immediately how different she looked from the confident flight attendant he'd observed on Friday. Her uniform was impeccable as always, but her posture was rigid with tension, her face a careful mask of professionalism that couldn't quite hide her anxiety. "Ms. Taylor," Richard said, rising from his chair to greet her. "Thank you for coming in." "Mr. Jenkins," Meredith replied, her voice steadier than he had expected. She accepted his handshake with a firm grip that suggested she was determined to face whatever was coming with dignity. "Please, have a seat." Richard gestured to the chair facing his desk. As Meredith sat down, her eyes briefly flicked to Sophie's drawing before returning to meet Richard's gaze. A faint flush colored her cheeks, but she remained composed. "I imagine you know why I've asked to meet with you today," Richard began, his tone neutral and professional. Meredith nodded. "Yes, sir. Regarding my conduct on Friday's flight with your daughter." "That's correct." Richard leaned back slightly in his chair. "Before we discuss that specific incident, I'd like to ask you something. Why did you become a flight attendant, Ms. Taylor?" The question clearly wasn't what Meredith had expected. She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Well, I always loved the idea of travel," she said after a brief pause. "Seeing different places, meeting different people. And I enjoyed the concept of hospitality, making people feel welcome and comfortable while they were far from home." Richard nodded. It was a good answer, and from the way she delivered it, he sensed it had once been genuinely true. 15 years is a long career, he observed. "What's changed since then?" Meredith's careful composure faltered slightly. "I'm not sure I understand the question, sir." "Let me be more direct," Richard said. "The person you just described, someone who enjoys hospitality and making people feel comfortable, was not the person I observed on Friday's flight. So I'm curious. What changed between the flight attendant who joined Skyway 15 years ago and the one who made an 8-year-old child cry for accidentally spilling her juice?" The bluntness of the question hung in the air between them. Meredith's fingers tensed slightly in her lap, the only visible sign of her discomfort. "That's a fair question," she finally said. She took a deep breath before continuing. "The honest answer is, a lot of things changed. The industry changed. The job changed." Richard listened quietly, giving her space to elaborate. "When I started," Meredith continued, her words coming more freely now, "we had more time between flights, smaller passenger loads, more staff per aircraft. Over the years, everything got squeezed. More passengers, fewer crew members, shorter turnaround times, more duties added to our workload." She gestured vaguely. "I'm not making excuses, Mr. Jenkins. My behavior toward your daughter was unprofessional and unkind. But you asked what changed, and that's part of it. The job became more stressful, more demanding, with less time to recover between flights. She paused, then added more softly, "And somewhere along the way, I think I forgot why I chose this career in the first place." Richard nodded slowly. What Meredith was describing aligned with reports he'd been receiving from various departments. Cost-cutting measures implemented by the previous operations director had indeed increased workloads across the board. It was one of the issues he'd been planning to address even before this incident. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "But you understand that regardless of these challenges, we have standards of customer service at Skyway that must be maintained." "I do understand that, sir," Meredith replied. "And I failed to meet those standards on Friday." Richard picked up Sophie's drawing, turning it so Meredith could clearly see it. "This is how my daughter felt after your interaction with her. Not just immediately after the spill, but throughout the flight. Every time you passed our row, she tensed up. Every time she needed something, she was afraid to ask for it." Meredith's professional facade crumbled slightly as she looked at the childish drawing. For the first time since entering his office, genuine emotion showed on her face. Regret, perhaps even shame. "I'm truly sorry," she said, her voice quieter now. "It was wrong of me to react that way. Whether you were the CEO or not, whether she was your daughter or any child, no passenger deserves to be treated like that." Richard set the drawing down. "Ms. Taylor, I want to be very clear about something. This meeting isn't happening because the passenger was my daughter. It's happening because the passenger was a human being who deserved better treatment. Had I observed you treating any passenger that way, we would still be having this conversation." Meredith nodded, accepting the rebuke now. Richard continued. "You're probably wondering about the consequences." Meredith straightened her shoulders slightly as if bracing herself. "Yes, sir." Richard folded his hands on his desk. "I believe there are two types of mistakes in this world, Ms. Taylor. There are mistakes that reveal a person's true character, their fundamental flaws or malice. And then there are mistakes that are out of character, moments of poor judgment from otherwise capable people." He paused, studying her face. "Based on your record and our conversation today, I'm inclined to believe your behavior on Friday falls into the second category. Would you agree?" "I would," Meredith said quietly. "It's not who I want to be." "Good," Richard nodded. "Because I'm not going to fire you today." Relief flickered across Meredith's face, quickly replaced by caution. The today in his statement clearly implied there was more to come. Instead, Richard continued, "I'm going to offer you a choice." He opened the folder containing her employment record. "Option 1, you take a 2-week suspension without pay, followed by 6 months probation. During that time, any customer complaint against you would result in immediate termination." Meredith listened carefully, her expression guarded. "Option 2, Richard said, is more unconventional. No suspension, no probation. Instead, I want you to help me develop a new training program for our flight attendants, specifically focused on interacting with our youngest passengers." Surprise registered on Meredith's face. "A training program?" Richard nodded. "You've been with Skyway for 15 years. You've seen the changes in the industry firsthand. You understand the challenges our crew members face. Who better to help develop a program that addresses those realities while still maintaining our service standards?" He leaned forward slightly. "The incident with my daughter highlighted a gap in our training. We prepare our staff extensively for handling disruptive adult passengers, medical emergencies, and security threats, but very little about the specific needs and challenges of children and families. I want to change that." Meredith seemed genuinely taken aback by the proposal. "You want me to help create this program?" "After what happened? Sometimes the people who have made mistakes have the most valuable insights," Richard replied. "You've experienced firsthand how stress and pressure can affect your interactions with passengers. That perspective could be invaluable in designing training that actually works in real-world conditions, not just in theory." He watched as Meredith considered the offer, her initial shock giving way to thoughtful contemplation. "The program would need to cover more than just how to respond when a child spills something," Richard continued. "It would address the entire journey from a child's perspective. How to make them feel safe and welcome. How to turn potential problems into positive experiences. How to help parents who might be struggling." "And you think I could contribute to that?" Meredith asked, a note of uncertainty in her voice. "I think you could lead it," Richard said firmly. "Under supervision, of course. You'd work with our training department and customer experience team. But yes, I believe you have something valuable to offer here, if you're willing to embrace this opportunity." Meredith was quiet for a moment, processing everything she'd heard. "May I ask a question, Mr. Jenkins?" "Of course. Why this approach? Most executives would simply fire me and be done with it. It would certainly be cleaner that way." Richard smiled slightly. "Because firing you would solve one problem, the problem of one flight attendant who had a bad day. But it wouldn't solve the bigger problems that contributed to that bad day in the first place." He gestured to her file. "You were an exemplary employee for many years. I'd rather reclaim that employee than discard her." He paused, then added, "Besides, my mother, the former flight attendant your captain mentioned, always taught me that how we handle our mistakes matters more than the mistakes themselves. This gives you a chance to transform a negative experience into something positive for the entire company." For the first time since entering his office, Meredith's posture relaxed slightly. "When you put it that way, option 2 sounds like the better choice." "I think so too," Richard agreed. "But it won't be easy. We'll expect real commitment, innovative ideas, and a willingness to be open about what went wrong and why." "I understand." Meredith nodded. "And I'm grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Jenkins, more than I can express." "Don't thank me yet," Richard said with a small smile. "There's one more thing." Meredith tensed slightly. "Yes?" Richard reached for his phone. "Diane, could you send her in now?" A moment later, the office door opened and Sophie peeked in, her expression curious but hesitant when she spotted Meredith. Richard's mother followed right behind, her hand gently resting on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Ms. Taylor," Richard said, "I believe you've met my daughter, Sophie. And this is my mother, Eleanor Jenkins, who served as a Skyway flight attendant for 32 years before retiring." Eleanor nodded politely to Meredith, her expression warm but evaluating. Sophie half hid behind her grandmother, eyeing Meredith uncertainly. "The first step in your new role," Richard explained, "is to understand the impact your actions had. I'd like you to apologize directly to Sophie, and then perhaps listen to my mother's perspective on customer service, particularly when it comes to our youngest passengers." Meredith swallowed hard, but nodded. She rose from her chair and approached Sophie, carefully kneeling down to the girl's eye level. "Hello, Sophie," she said softly. "I owe you an apology for how I treated you on our flight. It wasn't fair and it wasn't kind. I'm very sorry I made you feel bad about the accident with your juice. Everyone spills things sometimes, even grown-ups like me." Sophie studied her face for a long moment with the unfiltered honesty that only children possess. Then in a small voice she asked, "Were you having a really bad day?" The simple question, delivered without judgment, seemed to catch Meredith off guard. Her careful composure softened. "I was," she admitted, "but that's no excuse for being unkind. Your dad has given me a chance to do better, and part of that is saying sorry to you. Do you think you can forgive me?" Sophie glanced at her father, then back to Meredith. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Everybody makes mistakes," she said, repeating what was clearly a lesson she'd been taught. "Daddy says what matters is what you do after." Eleanor Jenkins smiled approvingly at her granddaughter, then turned her gaze to Meredith. "It seems you have a second chance, young lady. I hope you make the most of it." As Richard watched this exchange, he felt certain he'd made the right decision. The road ahead wouldn't be simple, for Meredith or for Skyway Airlines as they addressed the systemic issues she had highlighted. But this approach offered something firing her never could: the possibility of genuine, lasting change. "Well," he said, bringing the meeting back to order, "I think this is a promising start, Ms. Taylor. Why don't you join my mother and Sophie for lunch? I believe Eleanor has quite a few stories from her flying days that might prove instructive. We'll meet tomorrow morning to begin outlining the training program." As the three of them left his office, Sophie now chattering comfortably about her grandmother's cookies, Richard turned back to the window, looking out at the planes taking off and landing in the distance. Each one carried people with their own stories, their own needs, their own humanity. In the airline business, it was easy to get caught up in numbers, passenger loads, fuel costs, on-time percentages. But today had been a powerful reminder that beyond all those metrics were human experiences, moments of kindness or callousness that could shape how someone felt about themselves and the world around them. Starting with one flight attendant and one little girl, Richard intended to put the human element back at the center of Skyway Airlines, and somehow he thought as he watched another plane soar into the clouds, this unlikely beginning felt exactly right. 6 months had passed since that fateful flight. The crisp autumn weather had given way to winter snow, then spring rain, and now the warm sunshine of early summer filled the expansive event hall at Skyway Airlines training facility. The room buzzed with activity as flight attendants, pilots, ground crew, and corporate staff mingled, sipping coffee and chatting while they waited for the ceremony to begin. At the front of the room stood a small stage with a podium. Behind it hung a large banner that read Sky Buddies program launch in bright, child-friendly letters, alongside the Skyway Airlines logo. Richard Jenkins stood near the back of the room, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. He was dressed in a business suit today, no longer the incognito passenger in casual clothes. Beside him, Sophie bounced on her toes with excitement, her dark pigtails bobbing up and down. "Dad, when do I get to cut the ribbon?" she asked for at least the 5th time that morning. Richard smiled down at his daughter. "Soon, sweetheart. They're just getting everyone settled first." Sophie nodded importantly. At 9 years old now, she took her official role in today's ceremony very seriously. She wore a special blue dress for the occasion and clutched a small pair of safety scissors with ribbon-shaped handles, a gift from her grandmother Eleanor, who stood on her other side. "You look very official, my dear," Eleanor told her granddaughter with a wink. At 72, Eleanor Jenkins still carried herself with the poise of her flight attendant days. Her silver hair swept into an elegant updo, just like I did when I cut the ribbon for the new uniform launch back in 1982. "Tell me again about the hat you had to wear," Sophie said, momentarily distracted from her ribbon-cutting duties. As Eleanor launched into a story about the ridiculous pillbox hats of early airline fashion, Richard's attention was drawn to a figure moving confidently through the crowd toward the stage, Meredith. Taylor looked like a different person from the flight attendant who had entered his office 6 months ago. Gone was the rigid posture and defensive expression. Instead, she moved with purpose and enthusiasm, stopping to greet colleagues and answer questions about the new program. She carried a tablet with her presentation notes and wore a bright blue blazer with the new Sky Buddies pin on the lapel, a small pair of wings with a smiling cloud. The past 6 months had transformed more than just Meredith. What had begun as a disciplinary solution had evolved into a company-wide initiative that was already generating industry attention. The Sky Buddies program went beyond simply being nice to children. It represented a fundamental shift in how Skyway approached family travel. Diane, Richard's assistant, approached their small group. "We're ready to begin, Mr. Jenkins. You're up first, then Ms. Taylor will present the program details." Richard nodded. "Thank you, Diane. We'll head up now." He took Sophie's hand and, together with Eleanor, made his way to the front of the room. As they approached, Richard noticed several faces in the audience that he recognized from that original flight. The kind male flight attendant who had admired Sophie's drawing, the older flight attendant who had given Sophie an extra cookie despite Meredith's objections, and even Captain Winters, who had helped reveal Richard's identity at the Los Angeles airport. As Richard took the stage, the room quieted. He approached the podium and adjusted the microphone. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today for what I believe is an important milestone for Skyway Airlines." His voice carried clearly across the room. 6 months ago, I took a flight with my daughter, Sophie. It was Flight 372 to Los Angeles, a routine journey that most of us wouldn't remember under normal circumstances. He paused, looking out at the attentive faces. But this particular flight led to something extraordinary. Not because of who I am or who my daughter is, but because it highlighted an opportunity for us to do better, to be better as an airline. Richard gestured toward Meredith, who stood to the side of the stage. "Ms. Taylor will share the details of the Sky Buddies program in a moment. But first, I want to tell you how it came to be, because the story behind it contains an important lesson for all of us." He briefly recounted the incident with the spilled juice and Meredith's reaction, carefully framing it not as a story of blame, but as a moment that revealed a gap in their approach to customer service. The easy solution would have been to simply address one employee's behavior. Richard continued, "But as we dug deeper, we realized the issue was more complex. It wasn't just about one interaction gone wrong. It was about the pressures our crew members face daily. the lack of specific training for child passengers, and the need to remember the human element in everything we do. Richard glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. My mother, who served as a Skyway flight attendant for over 3 decades, often told me that the measure of an airline isn't how it treats its first-class passengers or its VIPs, but how it treats its most vulnerable travelers, the elderly, the anxious, and yes, the children. He turned slightly to smile at Sophie. When we make flying a positive experience for our youngest passengers, we aren't just earning their parents' loyalty for one trip. We're creating the next generation of air travelers who associate Skyway with comfort, safety, and joy. Richard gestured toward Meredith again. Over the past 6 months, Ms. Taylor has led a remarkable effort to develop the Sky Buddies program. She's interviewed hundreds of our crew members, spoken with child development experts, and worked closely with my mother to blend old-school hospitality with modern travel realities. The result is something truly special, a program that benefits not just our young passengers but our crew members and the airline as a whole. He stepped back from the podium. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce the architect of the Sky Buddies program, Ms. Meredith Taylor. The applause was warm as Meredith approached the podium. If anyone in the room knew about her initial encounter with Sophie, they showed no sign of judgment now. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, Meredith began, her voice steady and confident. 6 months ago, I made a mistake. I forgot something essential about our work in this industry, that behind every spilled drink, every misplaced bag, every minor inconvenience is a human being with feelings, anxieties, and dignity. She paused, making eye contact with various people in the audience. The Sky Buddies program was born from that realization. It's designed to give our crew the tools, time, and training to make flying a positive experience for children from the moment they arrive at the airport to the moment they leave their destination. Meredith tapped her tablet, and a presentation appeared on the large screen behind her. The program has 4 key components: preparation, prevention, positive intervention, and play. She walked the audience through each element: how gate agents would identify families traveling with children and provide them with Sky Buddies welcome kits, how flight attendants would be trained to prevent common issues before they arose, how to turn inevitable mishaps into positive teaching moments, and how strategic moments of play could transform a potentially stressful journey into an adventure. We've already piloted these approaches on 30 flights over the past month, Meredith explained. The results have been remarkable. Customer satisfaction scores from families increased by 47%. Stress levels reported by crew members decreased by 32%. And perhaps most significantly, we've seen a 68% reduction in in-flight incidents involving children. As Meredith continued her presentation, Richard watched Sophie, who was listening with rapt attention. He thought about the transformation that had taken place, not just in Meredith but throughout the company. What could have ended careers and created bitterness had instead sparked innovation and renewal. When Meredith concluded her presentation, the applause was enthusiastic and genuine. Several crew members were already exchanging excited comments about implementing the program on their routes. And now, Meredith said, it's my honor to introduce someone very special, the young passenger who, though she didn't know it at the time, inspired this entire program. Sophie Jenkins, would you join me to officially launch Sky Buddies? Sophie stepped forward, her face glowing with excitement as she approached Meredith at the podium. A blue ribbon had been stretched across the front of the stage, held in place by 2 flight attendants, one being the kind male attendant from the original flight. Sophie, would you do the honors? Meredith asked, gesturing to the ribbon. With great ceremony, Sophie took her special scissors and carefully positioned them on the ribbon. I declare the Sky Buddies program officially open, she announced, cutting through the blue fabric as flashbulbs popped and the room erupted in applause. Meredith knelt down to Sophie's level, not from necessity now, but as a gesture of respect. Thank you, Sophie. Because of you, flying is going to be better for thousands of children. Sophie beamed. Does this mean no one will get in trouble for spilling their juice anymore? Meredith laughed, a genuine warm sound that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. It means much more than that. It means we'll have special cups that are harder to spill. It means we'll respond with kindness to